Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on Oratory. I'm Lindsay Schultz, your host, and today I have my friend Sam Houston with me. He is a seasoned executive and growth strategist with a track record of transforming organizations in mining, metals, infrastructure, and heavy industry, and is the founder of Strategist Solutions. And he specializes in execution strategy, leadership development, and high impact project delivery. He also is an awesome executive coach and passionate advocate for cognitive diversity in leadership. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's nice to be here. Good to see you.
It's nice to see you too. I have gotten lucky this year and got to see you in person and have a few phone calls. So I feel like we're on the right trajectory for the rest of the year.
For sure. Yeah, we should celebrate always.
That's exactly right. So, what's getting you excited these days about your work in mining?
Well, Lindsay, as you said, I kind of do quite a few different things. I love my leadership development work. I do systemic team coaching as well as executive coaching, which is always super rewarding, I must say. And there's a huge need for it, I think, in the industry, particularly in mining, although I do work across multiple industries as well. But I'm really excited at the moment that I'm working with a big global organization on developing, it's kind of a downstream industry from mining and metals. I'm working on the development of some big battery gigafactories, which is super interesting. And it's also, I think, really relevant to the industry because it's so reliant on critical minerals for, the input for the product. And really interesting because it's really key for the electrification that we need in the industry and also what we need to do for the energy transition as well, more globally and more kind of from a macro level. So that's really fun and very new for me. I haven't really been involved in projects like this before. So that's fun. That's what I'm really excited about right now.
Well, I can imagine that it would be exciting because it hits, I think, a few different areas that you are passionate about. One, the sort of electrification and doing things a little bit better for sustainability purposes. And then two, the coaching aspect of larger teams. And I know that you and I talked about this in person recently, but one thing that you'd mentioned to me was that you were there and had all this feedback and weren't expecting to sort of make the impact that you did as early as you did. And so that was a really rewarding scenario. And I think sometimes when you're in the midst of doing coaching and being so present with the work that you're involved in, that you forget that other people don't understand it in the same way. And that by being a third party and getting them through these things, that it changes their entire perspective, and that really quickly you can see that light bulb moment. So I'd love to talk more about what the team coaching scenario really looks like, because I think that this is something that we're going to have to see more and more of in and out of mining, just because we have such skills gaps between senior executives and leaders and others kind of coming up internally in organizations. So this has been a soapbox of mine for a while. So can you tell me a little bit more about how the team coaching dynamic works?
Yeah, it's funny actually because mega projects in particular, mega programs, they are inherently very complex and complicated. And a lot of organizations, I think, focus too much on the economic and the technical components. Obviously, without viable economics and viable technical kind of deliverability and operability of these assets, then they wouldn't exist at all. But I think there's not enough attention played on all of the elements that kind of support the successful development, delivery, and operation of assets. And in particular, the people side. And I think that's something that is forgotten a lot in our industry. And it turns out in multiple industries. I've worked in infrastructure and oil and gas, as well as mining and metals, and now this kind of it's almost like a bit of a chemical type industry. And they all suffer from quite similar challenges, really, and particularly around the people side. And forming those teams in mega projects is absolutely critical to getting a successful outcome, in my opinion. So I think the focus, and quite rightly, probably right at the very beginning of these, is very much on proving that you can actually develop, deliver, and operate an asset that could be resultant from mega projects and programs. But I think the what that should shift very quickly into is the fact that you can't have mega projects and you can't have assets without people.
Right.
And if you can develop a culture from the beginning of the project around inclusivity, making sure that you've got that kind of cognitive diversity inherent in the actual mega project itself, then you're kind of setting the whole scene for being able to resolve some of the most challenging issues that you face when you're delivering these huge projects in very difficult circumstances normally. So I believe very strongly that we need to really invest in the teams and people right from the outset. When we're designing assets, when we're developing them, when we're making sure they're fit for purpose from a kind of a people, planet, and profit perspective, we need to do that right from the very outset of mega projects. I think we've got an opportunity with mega projects to make sure that from the outset we're considering the environment and the society that we're actually going to be operating these assets within. And if you don't have that diversity right from the very beginning and bringing in all of those different ideas and thoughts about what that asset could be operating within in terms of societies 10, 20, 30 years down the road, then I think we're missing a big trick. I think a lot of our legacy assets have really been designed for the incumbent workforce at the
Yeah.
time of the development of those assets, which was generally kind of white, middle-aged men,
Sure.
effectively. And without bringing that diversity into the development of our assets really early on, we're not really going to have anything different for our assets in the future. So I think it is really important for us to be able to bring in that diversity and be really inclusive of that right from the very outset of mega project development.
I absolutely agree. And I've had this conversation a few times recently, one with Emily King on our podcast a few weeks ago. And her message was we have to think forward, we have to be bold, we have to, at the risk of not doing something proven, figure out ways of making it be utilizable downstream, right? If you're going to create a project in a place that didn't have tons of infrastructure, figure out how to use some of the housing or whatever as a hotel, as a school, as something else. But you have to create an environment where it's not only dependent on the mine itself as well, right? And so creating and understanding the needs of the area around it by taking the time in the community, by figuring out all of the inputs and how long things are going to last, all of that impacts what it's going to look like. And then again, I chatted with Carly Leonida on her podcast, and she said, how do you foresee the workforce changing? And what kinds of individuals should we be looking at that are not traditional talent in mining? And when you said cognitive dissonance, that's a very different thing. Cognitive diversity. I thought immediately about that conversation because I think that there are so many skill sets that translate well into our industry, and we have done a poor job of supporting them. And part of her follow-up question was, how then do we create an industry that supports individuals who have never been a part of it? And so I'm going to ask you the same question.
Look, I think you're absolutely right. In terms of the diversity that we need in the business, we're not just doing it for the societal need and because it's the right thing to do. We also need to be looking at it from the benefits that it brings as well. The mining industry is absolutely critical for urbanization, for the energy transition, for so many of these big macro things that the world needs. And without mining, we're in a really bad place as a planet, effectively. So for us to be able to be the best industry, we're going to have to do things better. And to do things better, we need different people to come in, people with different backgrounds, experiences, different ways of solving problems. And that's generally kind of what we mean when we're talking cognitive diversity as opposed to demographic diversity based on age and race and gender and those kinds of things. So what we really want to be able to do is to bring people in who can help solve some of the mining industry's biggest threats, but also on the flip side, the opportunities that we have. So if we can steal some of those clever people from other industries, attract them into mining, we need to think about all of the functional background people as well. We're talking technology, we're talking about sustainability, finance, a whole heap of professions that don't even exist yet, I would say. Futurists, experts in AI, machine learning, all of those kinds of emergent technologies. Like they're the types of people that we need to bring into the industry to make sure that we can keep up with the demand that's being developed around the world for, well, for all materials and minerals, but particularly those critical minerals that are so important for us to be able to change, to make sure that we are supporting the planet and the people who we share that planet with well into the future. So yeah, absolutely. I think the cognitive diversity for me, I think, is both the biggest opportunity for mining and metals and also one of the biggest challenges. We, as an industry, we don't have a great reputation. Like you talk to probably more people than I do, but I really love going and talking to students, for instance, at university, engineering students, and talking to them about what they're planning on doing with their career. They have a massive amount of choice in terms of which direction they can go in with a qualification like engineering. And we need to, as an industry, kind of up the rung in terms of industry of choice for some of these very talented people to move into. But the reality is that the feedback I get from a lot of them is that they view mining as a difficult industry with difficult environment to work in, remote working, some difficult conditions in terms of just the environments that we deliver our assets within. There's a reputation of it being very kind of machismo, not accepting of people with diversity. So those are the things that we need to be able to try and change so that we can bring those people into our industry to make our industry as good as it can possibly get.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one of the things that I have really appreciated seeing more recently is as part of DEI that we have a B, which is belonging, right? And without that factor, you don't get to retain some of your individuals from diverse backgrounds, whether that's cognitive diversity or actually being from or looking like or being of different backgrounds than anybody else that you're working with. And I've always found that if you can figure out ways of supporting the individuals and the teams that you work with, that they'll stick together. Because over and over again, as a recruiter, I see people grab other people that they've worked with and they just like a basketball team or whatever, when they're functioning on all cylinders, you see the same thing happen in teams. And sometimes that is because they've figured one another out, but adding additional layers in doesn't mean that the team's going to be broken. It means that you have to figure out how to work as a team. And so, are there any tricks? Are there any strategies that you use on a routine basis that you want to talk about that don't preclude you being hired as a consultant to do this that we should be talking about or being mindful of as we all sort of aim to build teams around us so that we can get our work?
Yeah, look, I think there's not really any secrets about building teams. I personally think that there's always a place for someone external to come in and help to deliver that. And by asking for help as leaders, I don't think is demonstrating any failure on our behalf at all. As you said, the sports teams and things, they get help, right? Like they've all got coaches and staff and physios and all of these kind of support facilities are available to them. And I think a lot of leaders think that they are supposed to carry the entire burden by themselves. And I think that attitude needs to change. I think from my experience of being a leader and pulling in coaches and facilitators to help me has always been a great assistance to me. There's certainly a requirement to make sure that you're managing it properly and that you're being intentional about how you use those types of services. It's something that's incumbent on leaders to not shirk the responsibility of being a leader, but also not being afraid of having, I guess, showing the vulnerability as a leader to be able to ask for that help and to be able to bring that help in and use it in a way that is going to benefit and not just the leader. That's not what a team coach does. A team coach comes in to help the leader be the best they are, to help the team be the best they are, and then to radiate out that higher performance into the system in which that team is delivering within.
Yeah.
So I think in the past, you probably heard about high performance teams as an approach.
Yes.
And I think that that has probably generated more of a competitive approach with teams. I think a lot of teams who go through high performance team kind of activities are trying to be better than the other teams that surround them. And I think the approach that I normally take is more kind of systemic team coaching, which is about radiating performance, high performance out from the team and expecting high performance into the team from all of those kind of systemic stakeholders that are existing in all of the organizations that we operate within. So that's kind of what I advocate for, and it's the approach that I generally use with teams. And it takes a certain type of leader to be able to recognize that it's not all about them. And maybe by them kind of putting a stake in the ground around setting the right behaviors and styles and all of those great things, that they can be role models for other individuals, other teams within that system that they're delivering within. So yeah, that's a little bit about what I do with teams.
I appreciate your sharing that because I agree. And a few things really stand out from my perspective. And one is the idea that it's not weakness to ask for help. And I
Mhm.
think that often we have been trained in a professional setting to believe that we should know everything and that we
Yep.
should be able to solve the problem and rise to the occasion. And oftentimes, I think the concept of high performance
Yep.
does innately create competition
Yep.
versus collaboration. And some of the things that I really find individuals that do quite well and have organizations that build high functioning, I'll go with high functioning teams
Yeah. Yeah.
because they have strong leaders, not managers, leaders,
Mhm.
are those that will ask for help, that have sought consultants, that have worked with coaches, that have said, I don't know the answer to this. And as a team, we have to come together to solve this. And that also gives other people permission to ask
Yep.
for help too, right? And so if we go into all kinds of other areas like mental health and figuring out how to support one another and create that belonging idea, vulnerability is necessary. And so, even though it's a really scary term to use generally, much less at work, I think that it's really important. And I think that the more we talk about this and the more that our leaders and companies espouse these sorts of values, the better it becomes in terms of a workplace. One, to attract talent, two, to retain talent, three, to support the talent that you have. And like all of this is a self propelling scenario from my perspective. And we don't see it often enough. And sometimes when I say that, people say, well, give me an example of what that looks like. And often it's just one tiny team in a big organization, right? But when you were talking about kind of approaching this from a systemic standpoint,
Mhm.
when you have a good leader and a good team, other people start to look at that group and say, how can we replicate that? And so it's this ripple effect where I think that the old adage of like a bad apple spoils the bunch, you can do this in a positive way as well. And I think that there's so much power. And then when somebody learns that, and then they do decide to leave or move on, or the company sells, or whatever happens in mining, and go to the next one, then that becomes sort of like this little tree that grows and plants roots in all different areas. And recognizing these individuals who have the capacity and the willingness to be vulnerable and lead teams in that fashion, I want to know all of them. But when somebody asks me for an example, sometimes I flounder because they often go absolutely unrecognized. And
Yeah.
we don't have all these wonderful case studies to draw from in our industry because we're very guarded about what we let out. And that then puts me on my next soapbox about talking about what we do in a way that's not reactive but proactive so that we can attract talent from different areas and all of that stuff. But now I've gone on my soapbox and tangent about all of this stuff. So, God forbid. I really appreciate that you've now said it. But big hard question that I get back to you again, do you have great examples or companies that are doing an excellent job of this from what you can see out there? Or do we just not talk about it openly enough? And so everybody just goes under the radar.
It's a good question. I think from my perspective, I think mining is a difficult industry from that. It's like a lot of parallel industries that are, quite heavy and very safety oriented, quite rightly, that they've kind of had to create a hierarchy and they've had to create a very kind of autocratic, directive type culture because in the past, when we had a lot of operators, we still do have a lot of operators on the work face, so to speak, there really had to be a lot of protocols in place to be able to protect them, their co-workers, the assets that are all involved, all of those things. Now, I would say there's a bit of a shift in the industry, like particularly when we're bringing in new technology, when there's autonomous vehicles, there's remote operations, all of those kinds of things, where we are taking the operators away from the workplace. And I think that then changes the dynamic quite significantly because what you've then got are people sitting more remotely, maybe working more in teams, trying to make either incremental improvements on the way that they do things through automation and machine learning and all of those types of things, or they might be even working on massive innovations. So to do that, you definitely need those different types of team dynamics and different ways of bringing expertise and experience into play. Now, from my experience, like I haven't really seen a lot of what I would call the top performing teams in the mining industry. I have seen a little bit more of it in industries like tech in particular.
Yeah.
Like particularly if we're talking about teams that have been built to make big improvements on things and to create innovation.
Yeah.
And I think we were talking about this earlier, but to be able to bring that kind of approach into the industry by attracting that kind of talent, I think could potentially make quite a big difference for us as an industry.
Yeah.
And I personally would like to see that happen. I think mining itself is almost like a little bit of a closed shop in that way sometimes as well. Like there's a bit of mistrust, I guess, about bringing in different ways of doing things. We've got that attitude of we've always done it this way, so why would we want to change things? And
Yeah.
I think that's not going to serve the industry well in the medium to long term. So yeah, it's an interesting point though, Lindsay, to actually kind of go out, look for, and hopefully leverage that moving forward for the industry to change the way that we do things.
Yeah.
Hello.
Completely agree. So I think one of the things that I appreciate about other industries is that they seem to be less exclusive. Like you see people change industries and say, like, I worked in healthcare, I worked in high tech, I worked in this, that, the other, and that's normal for them. And I have spent my entire career supporting the mining industry. And so my perspective on what else is out there is so limited. And so then we get to look at, as an outside tech or construction or look at military, like, and often I have to think of alternative sources for talent for the mining industry, and all of the heavy industries I think are great, but I agree with you that tech is probably one that we should be looking at actively. And there's so much opportunity for some really cool changes. And like they may not always best teams or the most high performing teams, but if we can learn something from them about both failure and successes that they've rendered, I think that we wind up far ahead of where we're at. And I have had such great fun working with some of the companies that we support because they're coming in as sort of startups and a lot of times from tech or chemical or whatever to support the mining industry. And that's sort of like the only touch that I get outside of my very narrow silo of mining. But every time I find it really refreshing and so encouraging because they seem to have less mental limitations on what can be done and how we can be doing things differently. And so incorporating them and learning from both successes and failures, I think is a huge area for us to be thinking about. And I don't know why we've sort of just been this tiny little fraternal group for so long, but everything we do, as you mentioned, it could be cars and cell phones and technology, to medical devices, to infrastructure, to medicine, to whatever. I mean, mining really does touch every facet of what we do. And so
Yeah.
the fact that we've not done a good job of storytelling about it and
Yeah.
saying that this is the beginning of all the rest of this stuff just blows my mind. And so figuring out how to tell the story differently, I think is part of our challenge, not just looking at people outside of the industry, because telling the story differently will attract them,
Yeah.
making them recognize that they need us, for any lack of a better way of saying it, is part of what we need to be doing. And so I don't know. I know we've talked about this, but I think that we should all be thinking of it. And perhaps the rebrand is what we have to do. Mining is not served, our public image very well. So is it that we're sourcing critical materials for success? That's far too long of an industry name, but we need to come up with something else so that we can have
Yeah, absolutely. Do
great
you
freight.
know, risking kind of going back to what we're talking about before,
Yeah.
but the silos that we've created, I guess, the mining silo, I think you've kind of referred to it as a silo in itself, but even the silos within the silos, we even make it difficult for people to move between commodities
Yes.
in mining, which I find absolutely crazy. It must make your job quite challenging as well, like having these artificial kind of limitations that have been constructed by the industry.
It is an artificial limitation often,
Mm.
right? I think that there are a few areas perhaps that lend themselves to being absolutely a specialist. And probably those look like narrow vein underground mining and certain kinds of processing or chemical processes that have to happen, right? They're just they're so specialized that, like, if you're going to come from coal and try to go be a metallurgist for gold or something, that it's not that you can't learn. And if you want to, go for it. And I'd absolutely advocate for it. Hopping from one to the other is not exactly what happens. But for the rest of it, I mean, whether you go from project delivery into an operational setting, sometimes that's frowned upon, right? Or there's limitations around that. You can't go from coal to gold all of a sudden. You can't go from copper to whatever, surface to underground. And it's like we have some really incredibly bright individuals in our industry who have
Absolutely.
degrees coming out of and certifications and all kinds of stuff coming out of amazing schools. And the idea that we can't continue to learn and grow and expand what we do blows my mind. I mean, some people have no desire to do that, but there are a lot of continuous learners. And for us not to support that and be so short sighted is just crazy. And often I do wind up with individuals who come to me that say, look, I'm pigeonholed and I would like to do something else. And I love that. But often it's really difficult to kind of get them out of that artificial silo that they're in. So, yeah, I don't have a
What
solution
is
other
that
than,
kind of created that kind of silo mentality in
yeah,
the industry?
it's going to have to change from my perspective. And I think that we're running out of people. I mean, the statistics aren't looking good, right? We have so many people retiring and far fewer people coming into it. So we're going to have to borrow from outside of our traditional sources and what's coming out of university deliberately going into mining. And so I think that we'll see a lot of change. And as scary as it is, it's a huge opportunity, but it's going to create a stretch for those of us who have been in it to recognize and live in those silos for as long as we have. And so I think knowledge transfer, coaching, figuring out how to appreciate and welcome cognitive diversity are all ways that we'll have to get between where we are today and where we need to be. And yeah, it'll be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the way that we need to kind of look at it as well. I think there's a lot of fear about change. And I
Yeah.
think, you know, in our world at the moment, I think the only thing that we can really kind of bank on is that there's going to be a lot of change. Hopefully not as much as what's been happening over the last couple of months, but there's going to have changes in the way that we all operate, the way that we all live, and the way that we work, and the way that we interact with each other and those kinds of things. I think what's been interesting for me since setting up Strategist Solutions is the access that I've had to lots of different industries
Yeah.
and seeing how they work. One of the nice things about coaching, whether it's executive one-on-one or whether it's teams, is that you really get to kind of see below the surface. it's not one of those professions where you can kind of just gloss over things. To be really successful and to make kind of sustainable, resilient in performance, you really need to be able to dig deep. And having a look at how asset management companies work, I've worked in finance, energy, there's still work in the mining industry as well, and in multiple kind of jurisdictions, different size companies, those kinds of things. It's interesting to see what works and what doesn't. And I think that's kind of part of the power of the coach as well.
Mhm.
Sometimes teams, because they're inherently lacking diversity anyway,
Sure.
and that could actually be one of their kind of key opportunities is developing diversity. A
Yeah.
lot of them just don't know how to do that. They don't have the experience of being able
Yeah.
to actually do that for themselves and having kind of guidance around what to do to start that process off.
Yeah.
I think is one of the biggest benefits that an external person who's had a lot of visibility of how different things have worked in different environments and be able to bring that to bear to develop your team and your organization. I think that's something that a lot of the organizations that I've worked with have really benefited from.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that can really help organizations to try and develop that diversity and inclusion and hopefully foster that kind of sense of belonging that you were
Yeah.
talking about earlier.
Well, I guess this makes me think of two things, but we'll touch briefly on one and then we'll move into something else that I want to ask you about. From your perspective, when you come in as a coach and you help them create a space where they can actually, as you said, you can't gloss over anything, right? Creating change internally is hard, just like it's hard to do that as one person, but as an entire organization or as a small part of one. I imagine that part of what you're bringing to the table is not just the breadth of experiences and things that you've seen, but creating a foundation of safety to understand what they have internally as part of this team and then to appreciate it and foster it and grow it and figure out how to work together. Is that a good summation of it, or is there more to it than that?
No, definitely. A lot of teams that are not performing as well as they could have got issues with psychological safety. I think one of the things that we do very well in our industry is look after physical safety of the people who work in our industry and the communities that we support as well. So the amount of benefit that that brings, the mining companies do really kind of see safety as the number one priority. And you see mining companies offering assistance to local communities in times of need, whether it's natural disasters or whatever, you see that benefit being provided to local communities. But the psychological safety side is still not being addressed well enough. There's countless reports that have been produced over the last several years around the poor state that we have around, well, physical and psychological safety in certain parts of our industry. And teams are no exception to that. So a lot of teams possibly accept and maybe even propagate psychological safety issues, and they often are not really even aware that they're doing it.
Sure.
So it's usually one of the kind of key interventions that we do for team coaching. And again, a lot of the responsibility around how we charter these team coaching interventions comes down to having a leader who's very receptive to wanting to make a change. They need to be able to make a change. And some kind of sponsor as well in the organization. It's usually someone with some level of seniority and authority in the organization who's able to kind of be a guide and steer the direction of that team development. So generally, the first things that we work on are around psychological safety in teams. We normally go in and interview team members one to one. We then interview key stakeholders one to one. We collate a whole heap of information to be able to set a baseline around performance and
Mhm.
around culture, which includes the psychological safety levels that are present in teams. And then we kind of go into planning what interventions can be made to try and improve psychological safety, which has a direct link to the ability to be able to include people with different cognitive backgrounds or abilities, and to be able to draw as much value as we can out of all of those people, those humans who are wanting to contribute to making the team better, the organization better, ultimately the planet better. So it's a process, really.
Yeah.
And I guess the art around it is being able to have the experience to be able to do those interventions in the right way at the right time. So, and that's the bit that's always the fun part for me,
Yeah.
like being able to kind of drop those nuggets in at the right point, ask the right questions of the right people at the right time, so that
Yeah.
the team ends up by doing kind of a lot of their own work around their own development for themselves,
Yeah.
which does provide that sustainable, resilient approach to them being able to work on their own performance improvements by themselves, hopefully without a coach in the.
Well, it's a very teachable scenario, right? And so I think often you do need that guide and that first touch so that then you've created awareness and understanding, and then sort of this desire to push that and carry that forward because you recognize the results from it, both personally, professionally, in a team setting, as an organization. And then you see that ripple go out and out and out. And I love that because I think I've had a lot of conversation recently about the need to really espouse a value of psychological safety. And some think like, oh, this is just phooey, right? Perhaps they've always had that innately in their teams. When you go without it, you absolutely recognize the need for it. And I think just as 30 plus years ago, safety, physical safety became something that was really important, as it should be. I
Absolutely.
hope that we start seeing the psychological safety component become just as important and become part of that value stream that we get to move forward with our organizations in mining and other industries, because I know that it's not just us, but perhaps the spotlight on it with reports and other things coming out in the past several years is giving us the opportunity to pay more time and attention and fix it with purpose rather than just make it go away. And I think that you're right that it does take a sponsor, it takes a champion, it takes somebody internally that's willing to speak up and say, this is important. And you'll see all kinds of different value, not just from a philosophical standpoint, but value in terms of dollars and cents and what it does for the organization happen if you start taking care of people in that way. So I'm going to take a hard left here because we can talk about this stuff for days and days and days. But you mentioned to me that you were going to do something interesting. And so I'm putting it out into the universe because I would love to see this actually happen, Sam. Are you
Yeah.
going to write a book?
Yeah, I really enjoy writing. I've written a number of kind of article series over the last few years, and that's been really fun and rewarding. I did my master's thesis several years ago now, and the process of writing, I think, is really interesting. It's quite, I think, cathartic to kind of put your thoughts out on a page. And I thought because I think there's a difference that needs to be made around how we develop and deliver major projects and programs, in particularly around opportunities for sustainability, people, and technology. I think there deserves to be a book out there about how organizations and how people and how leaders can set themselves up for success in major projects, not just through the economics and technical side, which I think is very important, obviously, and it's something that needs to be done to prove viability of these assets. But I think there's a way that we can develop and deliver major projects in a way that is more encompassing for society and what the world needs, particularly through that lens of technology, sustainability, and people. So yeah, I'm a fair way through the first kind of draft. So it's exciting. I think the content's coming to me a lot quicker than I was expecting, to be honest.
Well, good. I am certainly very excited to read this whenever it is available. But like I said, I sort of just wanted to make sure that you put it out into the universe because I'd like to see this come to fruition very much. And I think that we certainly could benefit from it. And as you said, sort of tying those three components together is part of the challenge. And when you talk about it, I'm like, oh yeah, this is gonna be simple. It's never that simple, but I really appreciate listening to you make it sound that simple. So perhaps the book will give everybody some tricks and tools. But outside of that, I have so appreciated your sharing your time with us today and insights and experiences. And when the book is ready, or before it is, or when it's into the world, we will have to do this again as you go on your book tour. And I'll be like, "Ugh, I knew Sam before he had like the best-selling book." But
Global tour of
that's
the.
really
Thank you for calling that out because it's motivational for that people kind of know about it, I guess, and it makes it more important for me to do the work that I need to do to get the book out there and hopefully add some additional value around that. But thank you so much for inviting me onto your podcast. It's always a pleasure talking with you, Lindsay, and I look forward to our next conversation, which will hopefully be soon.
I'm sure it will. You can't escape me now. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Lindsay.